A single ice jam in a railroad switch can paralyze an entire city, halting trains, stranding freight, and costing millions every winter. When shovels shattered and propane torches failed at 40 below, engineers reached for something far more extreme. They took surplus fighter jet engines, actual MiG-15 and B-52 power plants, bolted them to railcars, and incinerated snow in seconds. This is more than a desperate stunt. It is the brutal heart of railroad survival. But every blast threatens to torch wooden ties, shatter windows, and rip the track right out of the ground. Why would railroads risk so much to use jet blowers? And how did these weapons of war become the last line of defense against the ice? A railroad switch is nothing more than a pair of steel rails that slide a few millimeters to the left or right. But in winter, that tiny gap becomes the weakest link in the entire system. The point rail and the stock rail are separated by a space that is often no wider than a pencil. That clearance is measured in millimeters, tight enough that even a thin layer of ice can jam the entire mechanism. Snow starts as a powder, but train after train packs it down, grinding it into a dense, icy slab. The pressure squeezes out air, and the remaining moisture fuses the snow to the cold steel. Within hours, the gap turns into what railroaders call ice concrete. It is not just slippery, it is locked solid. The throwbar, which is supposed to move the points, suddenly faces thousands of pounds of resistance. No amount of leverage helps when the ice is bonded to the rail at a molecular level. A foreman with a set of calipers can show just how little margin there is. Even a layer of frost as thin as a dime is enough to stop the switch from closing. When that happens, the signal system senses the incomplete movement and flips every light to red. Trains stack up for miles. Freight sits idle. Commuters wait in the cold. The entire corridor grinds to a halt, all because a gap smaller than a coin is now filled with frozen cement. Traditional tools, brooms, shovels, even propane torches cannot keep up. Men swing sledgehammers for hours, but the ice always wins when the temperature drops below -40. The geometry of the switch is unforgiving. Every moving part is exposed. Every bolt, every hinge becomes a trap for snow. The tighter the tolerances, the more easily they seize. One jammed switch can freeze a whole city in place. The enemy is not the blizzard overhead, it is the invisible vice of ice locked between two rails. That is why the solution had to be as extreme as the problem. Buffalo, New York, in the heart of winter, offers a lesson in futility. As the snow comes down in sheets, crews are dispatched to the yards with shovels, brooms, and propane torches. The work is relentless. Men in heavy coats and frozen gloves chip away at switches, swinging sledgehammers against ice that does not budge. The snow is not fluffy anymore. It has been compressed by the weight of passing trains, fused to the steel by days of sub-zero wind. Each hour, another layer packs on, and the job starts over. At -40 degrees, the propane torches sputter and die, their flames no match for the cold. The chemical de-icers poured into the gaps freeze solid before they can even begin to work. A switch that takes 2 hours to clear by hand can be locked up again in minutes if the storm intensifies. In the worst years, like the Buffalo blizzard of 1977, entire rail corridors vanished under drifts higher than a man. Switches disappeared, buried somewhere beneath a crust of ice concrete. Crews worked in shifts around the clock, but the storm always outpaced them. The railroad's timetable meant nothing. The only schedule that mattered was set by the weather. Freight destined for Chicago sat idle for days. Commuter trains never left the yards. The city's lifeline was choked off by a force that did not care about deadlines or manpower. Even when the snow lets up, the geometry of the switch is unforgiving. Every bolt and hinge is a trap for moisture. Every exposed surface a canvas for frost. The tighter the tolerances, the easier it is for the mechanism to freeze solid. No amount of brute force can loosen a throwbar welded in place by a layer of ice thinner than a dime. The men keep swinging, but the problem is not their effort. It is the laws of physics. The cold always wins, and the tools of the past simply cannot keep up. What is left is exhaustion, and the creeping realization that the enemy is not just the storm, but the limits of tradition itself. In the mid-1950s, deep inside Siberia, Soviet engineers faced a problem that no snowplow could solve. The Trans-Siberian Railway, lifeline of the East, was paralyzed by drifts and ice so dense that even rotary plows stalled out. The answer came from military scrapyards. Retired Klimov VK-1 turbojets, once the heart of MiG-15 fighters, were pulled from storage, stripped of wings and fuselage, and welded to flatcars. With 5,000 pounds of thrust and exhaust hot enough to vaporize rail frost in seconds, these engines turned the rails into a proving ground for brute force. Soviet rail historians recall the first VK-1 units roaring through Krasnoyarsk and Irkutsk in the winter of 1956, clearing switches that had been frozen shut for weeks. The surplus pipeline was simple. What could not fly anymore could still wage war on ice. A decade later, across the Atlantic, American railroads fought their own losing battle in the snowbelts of New York. The New York Central Railroad, battered by the blizzards of the 1960s, scoured military auctions for decommissioned Pratt & Whitney J-57 jet engines, the same power plants that once pushed B-52 bombers across the sky. By 1967, the first J-57s arrived at Selkirk Yard outside Albany. Mounted on flat cars, fueled by kerosene, these engines delivered a wall of heat and wind that could clear switches in minutes. Rail historians say the American approach was born not just from necessity, but from the sheer availability of surplus after two wars. Both sides, separated by ideology and ocean, reached the same solution. When winter fights dirty, you answer with jet fire. Turning a fighter jet engine into a snow-clearing machine starts with the simplest piece of railroad hardware, the flat car. These are open-deck platforms built to haul anything from lumber to tanks, but when the snow gets too deep, they become the launch pad for a weaponized solution. The engine, usually a Klimov VK-1 or a Pratt & Whitney J-57, arrives from the military boneyard, stripped of wings, electronics, and landing gear. What's left is a raw turbine, still capable of generating thousands of pounds of thrust, but now considered too unreliable for flight. For ground duty, that doesn't matter. The engine is bolted directly to the steel deck of the flat car, braced with heavy mounts to absorb the force of the exhaust. Reinforcement beams run the length of the chassis, distributing the weight and the vibration so the car does not twist itself apart under full throttle. Everything that touches the engine is thick steel and heavy hardware. The aim is to make the platform as rigid as a rolling furnace. Fuel is the next challenge. Jet engines are hungry, burning through kerosene or diesel at a rate that would bankrupt a commuter train in a single storm. Massive reservoirs are welded to the deck, or a dedicated tank car is coupled behind for longer runs. Fuel lines snake along the frame, shielded from heat and routed to aviation-grade pumps that can keep the engine fed for hours at a time. The crew rides in a makeshift cab surrounded by analog gauges, exhaust temperature, fuel pressure, and engine speed. The controls are simple but unforgiving: throttle, nozzle angle, emergency shutoff. At the business end, the exhaust nozzle is mounted on a pivot, allowing the operator to aim the blast with surprising precision. The entire assembly is a study in brute adaptation, military hardware, and railroad steel lashed together to wage war on ice. A jet engine mounted on a railcar sounds like overkill until you do the math. The first instinct is to just melt the ice. After all, heat is heat. But the numbers do not lie. To melt even a modest patch, say a slab of ice 1 meter by 1 meter and 10 centimeters thick frozen solid at -40 degrees Celsius, you need more than 40 million joules of energy. That is enough to run a household oven for nearly 12 hours, just to clear a single switch, and that is before the next snowstorm blows through. The trouble is not just the amount of energy, it is how ice absorbs it. Ice has a stubborn thermal inertia. Before it even starts to melt, every molecule has to be brought up from deep freeze to the melting point. The specific heat of ice is about 2.1 kilojoules per kilogram per degree Celsius. Then comes the real hurdle, the latent heat of fusion. That is 334 kilojoules per kilogram just to change state from solid to liquid. It is like paying twice, once to warm it up, and again to break the bond. When a jet blower fires up, the exhaust does not politely warm the ice. It slams the rail surface with thermal shock, over 500 degrees Celsius at the nozzle. The outer layer of ice flashes to steam in an instant, but the real trick is what happens beneath. The sudden temperature spike creates a stress fracture, shattering the bond between ice and steel. Under infrared, the heat front moves like a shockwave, cracking the slab before it can even think about melting. The result is not a puddle, it is a battlefield littered with fractured ice, ready to be blown clear by the next blast. A jet blower at full throttle is pure violence harnessed for a single purpose. 5,000 pounds of thrust, the kind that once launched a MiG-15 into the sky, now slams straight into a slab of ice. The exhaust doesn't just heat the rail, it hammers it with hurricane-force wind, tearing fractured chunks loose before they can even think about refreezing. Operators grip the joystick with both hands, eyes fixed on the switch points. Every movement of the nozzle is deliberate. Sweep left to clear the frog, snap right to blast the guardrail, then hold steady as the main line is scoured clean. The control is surgical, but the force is anything but. In slow motion, the effect is almost unreal. Shards of ice explode off the steel, caught in a blizzard of steam and debris. The sound is a wall of noise, 130 decibels of turbine scream, drowning out every other thought. A retired operator once described it as trying to steer a thunderstorm. Precision matters. Too long on one spot, and the ties below start to smoke. Too quick, and patches of ice survive, waiting to jam the next train. The art is in the balance. Just enough heat to fracture, just enough wind to rip free. In the hands of a skilled crew, a jet blower can clear a frozen yard in minutes, turning what was once a day-long siege into a running battle measured in seconds. The switch stands gleaming in the aftermath, steel still warm to the touch, ready for the next train to pass. When the jet blower roars to life, the ground shakes and the air fills with the scream of a turbine running at full throttle. The nozzle swings over the switch points, and 5,000 pounds of thrust slam the rails with a wall of heat and wind. Loose ballast, the jagged rocks that hold the track in place, does not stand a chance. The first blast sends stones flying, some launched so hard they have been known to shatter windows in houses 100 yards away. Operators have watched in real time as the bed of rocks beneath the rails is stripped clean, leaving the steel hanging in midair, unsupported, and dangerously unstable. But the real panic starts when the wood ties beneath the rails begin to smoke. These ties are soaked in creosote, an oily preservative that turns them into tinder. At 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, the exhaust does not just warm the wood, it ignites it. Flames lick up between the rails with no warning. That is why a water tank car always trails behind the jet blower, manned by a crew armed with hoses and shovels. The moment smoke appears, someone jumps down and starts dousing the ties, working fast before the fire can spread. Every run is a balancing act between speed and disaster. Too slow, and the track bed erupts in flames. Too fast, and the ballast vanishes, leaving the rails floating. The crew's job is to keep the line clear without burning it down or blowing it apart. For every switch cleared, there is a scramble to put out smoldering wood and replace rocks that have been blasted halfway across the yard. The aftermath is not just clean steel, it is a battlefield of blackened ties and scattered stone, proof that brute force always comes with a cost. A maintenance supervisor stands by the tracks in Boston, watching a machine everyone calls Godzilla. The nickname fits. This jet blower, borrowed from New York City, still prowls the MBTA lines when the forecast calls for ice storms that would defeat anything else. Most days, though, the old brute stays parked. Railroads now favor cold air blowers, machines that use enormous fans to blast air at up to 535 miles per hour. These modern units clear away loose snow and some packed drifts, all without fire, smoke, or the risk of shattering nearby windows with flying ballast. They are quieter, safer, and burn a fraction of the fuel. The supervisor explains that the cold blowers handle 95% of storms. But when the ice gets dense, or temperatures drop so low that nothing else can break the bond, the jet comes out of retirement. Crews weigh each storm, checking the decision matrix, fuel cost, fire risk, speed, and the type of snow. For the worst conditions, when the switch points are locked in a vise of ice concrete and every minute counts, they still trust the jet. It is not nostalgia, it is necessity. The same goes for Metro North, which keeps its jet blowers ready for nor'easters. The technology may be old, but the physics have not changed. When civilization needs the tracks open, there is still a place for 5,000 pounds of thrust and 1,000 degrees of heat. The rest of the year, the fan blowers do the job, quietly and without drama. But every railroad supervisor knows you do not retire the Dragon. You keep it fueled and ready, just in case winter brings a fight only a jet can win. Every winter, railroads still keep jet blowers on standby, not because they are efficient, but because nothing else wins against ice at -40 degrees. As climate swings grow more extreme, the line between order and chaos may hinge on brute force. Sometimes, keeping civilization moving means unleashing a little controlled mayhem. The world still needs its dragons. Drop your thoughts below. Would you ride shotgun on a jet blower?